Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Do you think of yourself as a scientist? Do the children that you love and teach think of themselves as scientists? 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 Citro has worn all the hats. As a scientist, a science teacher, a mom, a writer, and even a publisher. Woven into all of that is her passion for making science accessible and inviting for every child. She's the author of the popular series Zoe and Sassafras, an endearing beginning chapter book series that follows a relatable hero, Zoe, as she and her cat Sassafras, along with some support from Zoe's scientist mom, help a long line of fantasy creatures, all while incorporating important science principles along the way. It's that perfect fusion of fantasy and fact that keeps kids enthralled. She's also written the Curious Kids Science book, which is one of the best science activity books out there right now. And she also runs the publishing company Innovation Press, where she's guided a host of award-winning book projects, including a series of picture books that tell the true tales of a variety of scientists, particularly those who are traditionally underrepresented in the science field. And if that wasn't enough, her publishing company also works not only to create high-quality, inspiring books that spark imagination and wonder, but also they have set up several initiatives making it possible for them to donate books to schools and libraries that serve low-income neighborhoods. She is truly a woman on a mission. You'll want to catch what 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 has to say about helping children see themselves as scientists and how we can all learn to see that science is truly everywhere around us. I think she'll give you a lot to think about as she challenges us to see failure as a necessity and to overcome our adult tendency to over-control the science experiences and instead invite more ownership from our youngest scientists. You can find show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 31. This topic is also covered in the Why We Play collection, with several letters connecting play to science. If you'd like to own these letters too and want to share the importance of play with those around you, make sure that you hop over to notjustcute.com/whyweplay to download a free sample letter and get the conversation started. People don't value what they don't understand. Why We Play is designed to help people understand and value play in the lives of young children. Start spreading the word at notjustcute.com/whyweplay. These letters are also on special pricing for the end of the year, so now is a perfect time to grab them and start the new year sharing the importance of play. Okay, I'm so excited for you to hear 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞's insight, so let's jump in. 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You are doing some really amazing things with your publishing company, Innovation Press, and so I'm really grateful that you take some time out to talk with me about these things that you're doing. I think they're really impressive and really important to share with other people.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start out by having you tell a little bit about your background and what brought you to this point of being an author and a publisher, not just writing books, but also running a publishing company.
Yes, well, it's kind of a crazy story. So when my daughter was born, I started staying home full time, and then we had a second little one who had colic, and it was really intense. And so I was trying to engage my 3-year-old amidst a lot of screaming, and I started doing a lot of at-home activities that I thought, hey, like these are kind of fun. Maybe other people would enjoy them as well. So I started writing a blog called Fun at Home with Kids, which is literally the least imaginative name ever. But I was very convinced that no one would ever read it. So I was like, no, I'm not going to stress about this name. I'm just going to come up with something that works. Fun at Home with Kids. Sure, that captures it. And the blog actually took off quite a bit. And partway through that, I thought a lot about writing a book, because who doesn't want to write a book? And having a blog platform made that a lot easier. So I got my first book deal, and I wrote my first book, which was 150 plus screen-free activities for kids. And it was interesting being a part of a really large publishing house. I felt very overwhelmed, and I really wanted to have my hands on a lot of the parts of the book process because I'm very type A. So at the end of it, I had my book, but it was a very stressful experience for me. And I believe at the time I was one of like 600 books that were coming out in the season. Yeah, so it was a good sized publishing house. And once I recovered, from the stress of trying to photograph children for a book, which is really hard. And I wanted to write another book. I was just like, I don't want to do the same thing again. I really want to be kind of in control of everything, type A. But I couldn't self-publish either, just because my platform was really international. So it was kind of a tricky situation. Luckily I had a friend who owned her own publishing company, and she had international distribution, which is really hard to get if you are a new publishing house. And she put in a lot of good words for me, and I was very persistent and luckily convinced a distributor that had an international presence to take me on. And I started publishing just one book a year of my own activity books to build capital. And in 2017, we started taking on other authors and working on Kidlit rather than just activity books. So that's sort of how I arrived in the Kidlit area.
I think that's so cool. And you didn't mention, but I know this about you, your background is in biology, right? Did you used to teach biology?
I did, yeah. Before I stayed home with kids, I had my master's in education and science education, and I taught middle and high school during the year, and then elementary science enrichment in the summers.
So cool. And I love all of those first books that you had, those activity books, and they're really, a lot of them rooted in science and nature, and I recommend them all the time because I love that they're not just, here's a cool thing to do, but you really walk them through the scientific process and how to explore it, not just do a demonstration, but actually have an experience or do an experiment and kind of differentiating between those things. They're just so great. I'll make sure that we link those because they're fantastic resources.
Oh, thank you.
always sharing with people. Well, I think that's so amazing how you could take on this big, to me, that just boggles my mind how to, just writing a book sounds really overwhelming, but then to run the whole publishing company in the way that you've so strategically spread out. And I see this theme running through your books with this love of science that you have personally and that you're sharing with young children. And I just think it's so exciting. And I'm particularly grateful for it because my son is a follower. He was very excited to hear that I was talking to you today. He wants to be a scientist, my second grader.
Love
and
it.
One of his very favorite books is Zoe and Sassafras, which you write. It's a series of books. And in fact, the other day I got some science supplies out for him to do some color mixing with test tubes because it's way more exciting when you have test tubes for color mixing. And I got all the things set out for him, the pipette and the colors and the test tubes. And he's like, Mom, you forgot my thinking goggles, which for those of you that are not familiar with Zoe and Sassafras, Zoe wears her safety goggles. Those are her thinking goggles. It helps her have good ideas. So I just loved that he was like, I need my thinking goggles, Mom.
Gotta be fully prepared.
Exactly. So this is such a lovable series. It's so wonderful. And I think, like I mentioned, my second grader reads it independently, but I think even for, younger kids that are emerging readers, it's a great read aloud, like for your kindergarten, preschool age kids. And I can tell that you've put a lot of intention into this series and that it's not just a fluffy story. I love that about it as well. The teacher in me can see all these intentional strings running through it. Mm-hmm. And it's been a very well received series. I understand you've gotten several awards and recognition from literary groups and organizations on this series, which is well deserved. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit specifically about this series that you've been writing, a little bit of the process of creating Zoe and what it is that you hope that young children are getting out of this series of stories with Zoe.
Yeah, so when my daughter was breaking into chapter books, she is a voracious reader, and she burned through like just about every chapter book series that we could find really quickly. So I kind of got the idea of like, why not write a chapter book series that my own kid would enjoy? And when she was reading them, I would kind of peek over her shoulder, When she first broke into chapter books, I would be reading aloud. And I just thought to myself, like, wow, a chapter book is such a great venue for teaching just a little bit, you know. And she read the Magic Treehouse series, which incorporates a lot of history in a fun way. And I thought, you know, it would be really cool if we had a chapter book series that did that, but with science. So I kind of started playing around with that in my head. And between, you know, that and my daughter's deep-seated love of dragons, I kind of generated the general plot line for Zoe, and kind of took off from there.
I just love it. And because I know you a little bit personally, I love seeing your daughter pop up in the book every once in a while as well. And that's got to be so exciting for her.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she loves it. In the most recent one, she can't see Pip. He is a magical creature, and not everyone can see magical creatures. And I was like, I'm sorry, sweets. Like, you can't see him. I don't mean writing this scene.
It just is what it is, right?
Yeah.
I love it. And I love that with Zoe and Sassafras and with so many of the books that you write or that you oversee as a publisher, I've noticed that you're really, I think, doing an intentional job of introducing children to a lot of underrepresented people in science and math. So you've got Zoe, who is a fictional character, but a great representation as well. But you've got some great picture books that introduce them particularly to women and minorities, as I mentioned. So people like Dr. Patricia Bath and Ray Montague and Dr. Temple Grandin. Why do you feel it's so important to have this kind of representation in science and in the science literature? Why is it so important for our children?
So it's funny. I'll tell you a story about when my daughter was 4. And it was something I had never noticed. Just she had always seen female doctors. And so we had moved and we were going to a new medical practice, and a male doctor walked in and she was like, "Where's the doctor?" And I was like, "Well, this is the doctor." And she's like, "No, doctors are always girls." Like, duh. And it was funny to me because I hadn't realized that she had kind of made that rule for herself based on her experience. But it's just a really good example of how, you know, we don't necessarily think kids are making rules in their heads, but they really are. And so if you're a child and you never see someone who looks like you in a book doing science, you kind of make a rule like, oh, only people who, you know, are white men do science. And like, I could obviously never do science because it's just not something people like me do. So we really try and combat that and bring a more balanced view of who scientists really are with our books, because I don't want kids making the wrong sets of rules in their heads.
Right.
About who can and can't do science.
I love it. And the thing I appreciate, like you said, that it's so important for children to see themselves in books, and it's so important for them to see their friends in books, right? So I have 4 boys, so I have 4 white males, right? And I love that my 7-year-old, when I pulled out, I think it was A Girl with a Mind for Math, it's the one that we pulled out. And his first response when I read the title, showed him the cover, and he said, "Hey, that's like me," which, you know, by demographics, it's nothing like him. It's absolutely zero like him. But he found that connection that, yeah, I have a mind for math and she has a mind for math, and that he could build a connection with somebody who was different from him. So I think it's so important, I think personally, to have representation in our literature, and like you're doing specifically with science representation in that literature, so that they, like you said, can see themselves, but also can connect with people who are not like themselves. I think there's that equal importance and equal value that we get out of both sides of that coin.
Definitely.
So important. So as you've done this, and as you've kind of overseen these projects that have told the stories of some of these scientists that I've been loving reading through them to learn about some of these scientists that I didn't know about. And I'm curious, as either through those projects or just your own evolution as a scientist and as a writer, if there are any particular scientists that have kind of become your personal favorites, or that you've learned particularly important lessons from. Who are some of your favorite scientists?
Oh man, I don't think I could choose. Just this whole process, like you said, of learning about people who have just been like hidden in history has been really eye-opening and depressing. But it's also such an honor to be able to bring their stories sort of to more people and to be able to share them. And with the series of picture book biographies, it's been really special because we've been able to work with the scientists that are featured themselves to make sure that we are telling the story that they want to tell, that our story is accurate. And, they've shared personal stories and family photographs with us that show up in the timelines. And it's been an honor to get to know them.
I love that. And that's one of my favorite things that you have in there at the end of that biography series. At the end of each story, there's a letter from that person to the child, kind of a letter of encouragement, I just love that personal touch to it. It's so great. And just the whole layout. So you've got the story, and then you've got the kind of usually like a timeline or a biographical kind of more that me as an adult, I'll sit there reading, and my kids are like, Mom, we're on to the next book. Move on. And I'm just engrossed in like, what I got to read the rest of the story, this kind of grown up level. But that letter is just one of my very favorites, and they're so short and sweet and simple, but I just think they're so powerful to hear this whole story about this great scientist. And then for many of them to have that letter that speaks right to the child, like it's their friend, their cheerleader, kind of encouraging them in their path to follow their dreams or to engage with science and that sort of thing. I just think that's such a great touch that you've added there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts too.
And I loved reading about Evelyn, the entomologist, which, at first I'm not super into bugs. So I'm like, all right, Evelyn, the entomologist. But I just loved her story of coming onto the scene in these early 1900s, have these different expectations of women. And I love that repeating phrase that she just did it anyways. There were things that were not expected of her or people thought she shouldn't do, and she did it anyways. And even into old age, that was the other thing I loved about it, that it was this whole lifespan view. And I just really, as a little bit of an Henri contrarian, I loved that. She just did it anyways. And just such a great, I have really enjoyed coming to know these scientists alongside my boys. So that's been fun.
Yeah, Evelyn is definite grandma goals for me.
Right?
Like, if only we can be that cool when we're that age.
I thought the same thing. I'm like, when I am an old lady with white hair, I want to go to this, remote tribal area and fall down a mountain and collect my samples.
Exactly.
And make science history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So everybody has to read about Evelyn the entomologist. It's a really good story. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is that it's so interesting as I teach and work with teachers and talking about how we, as adults, we tend to categorize things, very neatly and cleanly, like in our little file folders of our file cabinet. But so often for children, it's more of a webbing, and it's connected. Things are connected in a different way than we like to organize. And I think that that's true of science and literacy as well, that, again, so often, if you're going to a conference or workshops, you're going to go to a science workshop, and then you're going to go to a literacy workshop, and these are these separate ideas, but that you've really woven them together with these projects, science and literacy as well. So why do you think it's so important for you in your projects, but also for children on their experience side, to connect science and literacy and literature together?
When we were in our master's in teaching program, they taught us a lot about integrating subjects, and it was always so much more interesting to me when you could utilize everything. And one thing that I try to communicate through our books is just how science is everywhere, and it's kind of an everyday thing. And I think the more you can show how that integrates with math, with art, with literacy, with history, that kind of makes it more important to kids and makes it more accessible. So it's something we try and do, is just integrate it all as much as possible. Like you said, kids kind of think of it as a web, and it's maybe more of an adult approach to separate it out. So try to make it all webby.
Right, get it webby for them, right? That's all we try to do. We just try to get things webby. Well, I think you kind of touched on something there. You mentioned that science is everywhere, and helping children to see that science is everywhere. But really, I feel like helping us as adults to see that science is everywhere, because I really feel like children are born loving science naturally. They're naturally curious. They are naturally, as children, they're wondering and asking, and we even call them little scientists, right? That they are just natural born scientists. But for some, that starts to dwindle as it's almost like they age out of science for some of them. And so I'm curious, from your extensive experience, what you think are some of those key experiences or attitudes and approaches that we can have that can help, I almost want to say foster love. That love's already there, but like keep it lit and keep that love for science going for young children as they grow, so that it isn't something that just fades out.
Well, I think the most important thing is sort of shifting how we were taught science. So when we were in school, pretty much you can make the generalization that like your science experience was like your teacher handing you an experiment that was written by someone else with like step by steps, and like you had to follow it exactly. And if you followed it exactly, you got a perfect result, and everyone's result matched it. So that's not really how science is. And in addition to like not actually preparing kids for like real science, it also kind of gives the impression that like you're not the scientist, like whoever wrote this experiment is actually the scientist, and you're just like trying to be as good as they are. It's kind of a weird message. So we try and get away from that, with our books, and with Zoe and with the 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 science book, which is one of my activity books. We really try and emphasize like kids are the scientists, and like they should be designing the experiments. And for sure you can, weigh in and help, but like they are the ones experimenting. They are the ones in charge. And it's a really interesting shift. Like you said, kids are such natural scientists. So I like to talk about, in the 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 science book, what I did is, provided like a little bit of structure, since it's for kids ages 4 and up. And so I provided the scientific question, and then I went and worked with different scientists, ages 4 to 8, and I wrote in the book, what they decided to do. But the impetus of the book is like for your child to like look at what that child did and then like decide what they want to do to answer the question. So one of the questions in the book was, will plants grow if you water them with something that's not water? So, adults would come to that and be like really weirded out to start. But also like, we might choose pretty tame things because, we're thinking about it with an adult lens. So the 4-year-old I worked with for that particular project wanted to water the plants with milk, which like I can tell you no adult is going to want to do that because we all know how much it's going to smell. Right. And so her mom was great, great sport. And they watered the plants with milk, among other things. And it was like incredibly smelly. Like they had to move it out on their porch, but the plant grew, and it actually ended up growing just as well as the plant that she watered with water, which is so interesting. And I feel like, if you gave that experiment to an adult, we're kind of got that like restricted lens, and we'd be like, oh, that's going to be too smelly. I don't want to try that. That's too crazy. But we can learn so much from kids if we kind of give them the keys to the science car, if you will. So I try and model that a lot with Zoe. Zoe is in charge of running these experiments to find out how she can help these magical creatures. So that's one thing. And then 2, like a thing that we are missing from, traditional science education is failure. You're kind of set up to have a successful experiment every time when you are following someone else's step-by-step direction. Yes. And science is so much about failure. If you were in a science lab, like you are failing all the time. And I feel like if you have spent your whole, K through 12 education, like always having successful experiments, and then boom, right, you're going to feel like, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? And so I try and talk about that a lot. Like failure is important, and it's part of science. And you learn from your mistakes, and it's not at all abnormal to fail. Like it's very regular and very integral part of science learning. So I think, having those 2 things, having that ownership and then understanding that failure is like sort of a method to keep learning and is not a negative thing in science. Right. Well, important.
Yeah. And I feel like they really fit together. As you were talking about the first, I kept thinking, and it's so important to give them that ownership because they need to experience that failure and that it's a part of science. So I really feel like they fit together. And I love how you walk through how to really scaffold and support that authentic interest in those real questions. We teach the scientific process, and one of the first things is, to make an observation and make a question. And if they can't own those questions, then it really, it negates the whole process if they don't get to be a part of that. So I love how you support that and how you open it up, just as you were saying, to failure. I was thinking, again, as you were talking about letting it be authentic, I think so often as adults, like you said, we cut it off because we know where the problem will be or we know where the failure will be. But we know that because we've already experienced it. And when we kind of over orchestrate and make things too neat and tidy, we rob them of those experiences and also of that learning experience of failure. And I so 100% agree that it's so important in life in general for kids to be able to learn from their failures, but also, like you said, that it's such an important part of science that a failure is just another success, right? You learn something. Yeah. And you learn something that is not true, right? Or you get a little bit closer, you refine your question. It just all helps with the process. So I love that you emphasize that. And I think it's so important. Well, I could talk to you about so many other things, so I appreciate you giving the time, but I do have one more question. I asked my 7-year-old, I told him that I would be talking to you. He was very excited. So thank you for giving me a little bit of mom street cred there. But I asked if he had any questions for you, and he had a very important question. He wanted to know if there will be a Zoe and Sassafras number 8. I think he's in the process of reading number 7 right now.
Nice. I hope so. I plan to, but it's always hard to find time to write.
Right.
But I do have an idea for number 8. So that's always a promising start. So I would say like 75% chance. Yeah.
Well, if you ever need a focus group or someone to bounce some ideas off of, I know a guy.
Nice. You know a scientist.
Right. I know a scientist. Even better. Yes, I do know a scientist, and he will bring his thinking goggles.
Excellent.
Awesome. Well, Asia, thank you so much for talking with me, and thank you for this amazing body of work that you're putting out into the world for our children.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 31. You'll also find links to several of Asia's excellent books and her blog, along with other interesting tidbits addressed in this episode, including a link to some great Books Plus gifts for young scientists. Show notes will also share a link to the Why We Play letter, so you can check those out and download the free sample letter. Go to the show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 31. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com, and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.